As a firm handshake and hello from FromSoftware, Elden Ring serves as a well-polished, horrendously flawed title to let us in on what the studio has been working on for the 3 years following Sekiro's release. What people seem to understand about the game to an obnoxious degree is that it has a vast open world, a large number of items to discover, and a great deal of bosses to conquer. What people continually miss or leave out of that description even months after the game's release is that these facts do not represent, in any fashion, the amount of things available to do in the game, or the quality with which these experiences were crafted. As a matter of fact, I'd wager the amount of genuinely hand-crafted, unique content that Elden Ring sports is just as much as any of the games in the Dark Souls trilogy. And I say that including Dark Souls 2 out of the bunch, which, despite its copy-and-paste template for much of its content, did manage to sport a large, branching world with a large number of bosses to defeat and items to discover. Elden Ring is a title that's graced the gaming community when trust in AAA studios is at an all-time low. The most popular titles with the biggest budgets and largest set of talent on deck seem to produce some of the most poorly crafted experiences in the industry, while independent creators time and again continue to create genre-defining IPs. FromSoftware is an exception to this trend, for the most part, and has managed to create not only great Dark Souls experiences, which Elden Ring is very much a DNA replica of, but has also taken huge risks in developing unlikely feats of game development in Sekiro and Bloodborne, both of which were crafted very much from a different cloth than the Dark Souls template. I understand that FromSoft hasn't always been a AAA studio developer, and after Dark Souls 1, the company was still probably unknown to a great majority of the Western gaming audiences, despite being in the business since 1994. This isn't a hit against FromSoft or Western audiences at all, it's just a simple fact that the studio didn't really take off in popularity until after the release of Dark Souls 1, and even then flirted dangerously on the surface of obscurity after releasing the absolute mess that was Dark Souls 2. With the subsequent releases of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Sekiro, the potential for an obscure fanbase completely disappeared as the quality of their product proved itself to be the best in the business. After Sekiro's release, FromSoftware fans eagerly awaited the next masterpiece in the Miyazaki creative saga, but this masterpiece never came. Instead, fans were given Elden Ring. Elden Ring has arrived at a particularly trying time indeed, and its reception has been an accurate reflection of that. People want something incredible to sink their teeth into, but have been treated to almost nothing but lazy rehashes, migraine-inducing cash cows for children, and corporate, lifeless, talentless pieces of trash that only exist to absorb the consumer's attention and money, with no risk-taking, boundary-pushing, or innovation in sight. As fans began pouring their hours into Elden Ring, it only made sense that the reception would be an overwhelming ovation. Most of us have been starved for even a taste of incredible game design these past few years. And if you took the Dark Souls formula and stripped it of its RPG elements, intricate world building, and handcrafting experiences, it would still be a decent game on the few remaining qualities it has left, and that's exactly what Elden Ring is. Elden Ring is a somewhat decent game with skill-testing combat, a lovely, gripping story reminiscent of the Dark Souls themes, with less of the cycle of lifeness and more of the cycle of power template. It has plenty of areas and items to discover and study to get your fill. Elden Ring is also a soullessly developed game that prioritizes quantity over quality and refuses to respect its players' time or interest in the game at all. The combat pours out over many different styles, spells, weapons, and summons, but is so poorly balanced and badly designed in some cases that the wide array of weapons and spells quickly turns into a huge fucking host of shit weapons and spells, and one narrow cone of these are obviously better than the rest, things you feel compelled to use if you want to enjoy a playthrough, a first-time playthrough that is, to any reasonable degree. The numerous items and areas to discover turn from carefully handcrafted and potentially useful in the beginning of the game to dull areas, copy and pasted spam bush enemies, and crafting items that are only theoretically useful in a second playthrough when you would understand how to best utilize them. And even then, the crafting system only serves to marginally shore up the player's weaknesses in certain builds, or allow them to cheese an otherwise difficult part of the game. I understand that these are wild claims to anyone who is only half paying attention when they play through this game, and in the current climate might seem tone-deaf considering the overwhelming praise this title is receiving. But I'm going to prove to you that my arguments have their objective bases by going over the game's sprawling content in a way that a new player might, as I did, and introducing each and every problem with the game as they pop up. Some fundamental stuff first. It's important for this review that you understand what I think about the game up front. The combat is as solid as any Dark Souls game can offer. The exploration is as expansive as any Dark Souls game can offer. The boss fights and enemy placement can be just as good as they've been in any Dark Souls game. And I think FromSoftware managed to create a somewhat fun experience that, at the very least, has enjoyed some incredible commercial success. There are things to praise the game for, but ultimately, Elden Ring fails not only in pushing the envelope of what we can expect FromSoft to put out, but actively repeats many of the mistakes they made in other titles. And does it often enough that I can't attribute these mistakes to accidents or forgetful moments from the developers. I have to make the assumption that the studio saw their product and was okay with leaving these glaring flaws in the final draft. Elden Ring is a decent game. Elden Ring is also an extremely poor FromSoftware game. And although that may sound like a compliment in some respect or another, I don't want anyone misunderstanding me here. I mean that in the worst way possible. This isn't a video about how great the studio is, but rather an account of all the issues and lazy design seen in Elden Ring that are leading me to ask questions about the studio's future as something I hold in high regard. The game actually begins at the Chapel of Anticipation, where players are met with the first boss fight of the game, and will likely get a rush of excitement in knowing that their first enemy they see is a boss. A difficult one for a first-timer, and for most players, death will be the result of this encounter, setting the player to what I will be calling the true starting point for the game, the Stranded Graveyard in Limgrave. Here, players will encounter a neatly made tutorial that FromSoftware likes to pack into the start of their games. Things like parrying, rolling, sprinting, jumping, and the new guard counter mechanic are introduced here. There's nothing much to say about this except that I feel the tutorial is extremely well designed. Not only is it quick to run through, unlike the tutorial in Dark Souls 2, it also presents itself as a fairly obvious route to take with an NPC actually pointing you in the right direction, as opposed to Dark Souls 1, for example, which just featured some messages sprawled on the ground which aren't exactly intuitive things to seek out for players who haven't been exposed to them yet. Moving on, the player is treated to their first glimpse of the new Stone Sword Key required area, the Fringe Folk Hero's Grave. The Stone Sword Key is FromSoftware's alternate take on the Fragrant Branches of Yore from Dark Souls 2. The Fragrant Branches acted as a key to unlock shortcuts, blocked off areas, or next to nothing at all. And the Stone Sword Keys are the absolute better design choice for a few reasons. Firstly, the keys don't cost 6 months of fucking rent to buy. Secondly, they are more plentiful than you're likely to need unless you happen to run into one imp statue seal after the next on accident, or if you don't save a small amount of spare runes to buy them at every trader you can. Lastly, all the content locked behind these keys are things you will want to participate in, or would want to participate in if you enjoyed the game to any reasonable degree. There's very few times where you would have felt you'd have been better off just not using a key after the fact, both because you'll gain a lot in terms of power and game content from using them, and because you'll likely have plenty of them anyway. These are all things that could never have been said for Fragrant Branches of Yore, unless you happen to be a veteran of Dark Souls 2 and know which branch areas to unlock and which to leave. Once up the elevator leading out of the Stranded Graveyard, the player gets its first glimpse of an outdoor Limgrave. In my opinion, the initial hit of the pure artistry displayed by FromSoft here is overwhelming. For a first-time playthrough, this kind of visual is really what throws a casual player into a hardcore mindset. The world opens up before you. There aren't just beautiful Earth-like scenes blessing your eyes either. There are otherworldly creations, potential foes, friends, lovely attire, luscious grass, and the feeling of an untapped experience being held just out of grasp. And that feeling pulls you in for a 50 to 100 hour playthrough, and for better or for worse, that yearning for a full and rewarding adventure doesn't really stop when playing Elden Ring. Honestly, the footage I have access to through YouTube's compression and my own hardware's limitations just don't do the game justice. It's just something you'll have to experience yourself to truly understand. The game is gorgeous looking and has aesthetics that alone are blissful. But this bliss is also met with the horrific realization that your frames are dropping, and at this point you might actually be experiencing some hangups if your PC isn't all that powerful. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I don't think this point is particularly important to the overall quality of Elden Ring. But the dev's ability to produce content that can actually run on their player base's hardware is very important for the moment-to-moment fluidity experienced by a user. Now, this drop in performance that every player experiences so early in the game isn't exactly a rarity, but it isn't anything that gets so bad that it makes the game unplayable either. This issue is undoubtedly due to the sheer size of the game, and although there are definitely improvements that need to be made, and are being made, it doesn't surprise me that FromSoft hasn't been able to completely patch it out at the time of writing the script, since it just seems to be the nature of the beast. Is it a negative? Yeah. Does it make the game particularly poor on its own? No, of course not. I can recall such issues being seen in the Prepare to Die edition of Dark Souls 1 for PC, and if memory serves, both console and PC versions of the game had an inherent flaw, in that any time players moved into Blighttown, frame stutters and performance drops were absolutely fucking horrendous and didn't go away. It was just something that happened and everyone knew about it, so everyone dealt with it, and it was there for so long before the remaster arrived that veterans of the game just stopped noticing it altogether. With Elden Ring, it's basically the same thing, except it's almost present throughout an entire playthrough, or at least something that comes and goes seemingly regardless of where you are, and depending on what hardware your PC benefits from. And unless you've got an RTX 3000 series GPU paired with a strong CPU, or, more simply, a couple grand sitting in your back pocket, there isn't much you can do about it. It is what it is, and I don't think what it is warrants any serious consideration on the game's quality as a whole, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Well, I Mask Vare is the first NPC to greet you outside the Stranded Graveyard. He gives you the rundown on what's happening with the world, what you are, and what the Grey sitting next to you is. He then makes fun of you for not having a girlfriend and tells you to fuck off to Castle Stormvale. It is just after finishing this discussion, in my opinion, that most players will feel like they are actually playing the game. From here, you can do whatever your skill allows you to do, which probably isn't going to be much, and after the motivation for killing the Tree Sentinel wears off, I'd say roughly 70% of the players will continue on to the Church of Ella, where they'll be introduced to smithing, trading, and crafting, and another Site of Grace. Sites of Grace are Elden Ring's take on the bonfire from the Dark Souls trilogy, where the only difference between the two, aside from aesthetics and their ties to respective lore, is that Sites of Grace actively point the player in the direction they should be going to complete their likely objective and can be teleported to from almost anywhere. For some Sites of Grace, they'll point you along the main story's path, but many can also just point you in the general direction of the next boss or area of interest. For a game of this size, FromSoftware felt it was important that the players had some sense of direction to apply themselves in, and threw in the Grace arrows as a way to make their game more accessible to the soon-to-be millions of new players trying their style of game out for the first time. I have no opinion on this decision one way or another, but I do want you to keep that principle of accessibility fresh in your mind throughout this review, as it will come up quite a bit in the future. From the Church of Vanilla, players on a blind playthrough might run off in any given direction, and although everyone who knows anything about the game is going to go straight for the Gatefront ruins to grab Torrent from Melina, I'm sure many people, like me, would have stopped to explore for a great while before following the path laid out in front of us. A blind player might defeat the Beastmen of Far Missoula, the Squidlies on the beach west of the Stranded Graveyard, the Demi-Human Chiefs to the south before discovering the Church of Dragon Communion, and then may very well get sent straight to Caelid early through the Dragon-Burnt Ruins teleport chest, all before finding Torrent. I say this not as a potentially negative experience that one might have of playing blind, but rather because this was my exact experience on my first playthrough. In my opinion, this is just a testament to the design of Limgrave and how it offers players an unbelievable host of adventures to go on right off the bat, and easily presents itself as the most carefully crafted part of Elden Ring's map as a whole. Even without the convenience of having a mount to speed around the map on, Limgrave feels full enough to where I just didn't mind, despite seeing all the signs telling me to go find one. At least for a first playthrough, this is true. If I were to start up another run knowing what I know now, I definitely wouldn't spend a single second I didn't need to without Torrent. All the same, the main area of Limgrave represents the best that Elden Ring has to offer in terms of compact design, evenly spread out content, and making good on its vision to provide players with a gaming experience that walks the fine line between open exploration and handcrafted set pieces. Upon clearing out the ruined fortress near the gatefront, collecting some loot, and meeting Melina, the most consistent part of the game is behind you, and what lies ahead is a very small number of issues that are found in one part of the game to the next. These problems are minor and generally won't bother the average player by themselves, but as the game moves from one location to the next, these problems don't go away, they simply compound on top of each other until the bread and butter of the game's design is almost completely made up of problems, with some good fighting mechanics sprinkled in as a meager attempt to keep the player satisfied. Out of all of the Elden Ring areas that left a bad taste in my mouth, Stormhill is tied for third right next to the Caelid Wilds. This area, for the vast majority of players, is first introduced through the gatefront, from which Melina meets you. This gatefront is guarded not just by a huge swath of soldiers which, up to this point, were often fought in pairs at most, in 1v1 or 1v2 scenarios, with the opportunity to apply stealth solutions to the fights, but also by a fuck-off giant that jumps into the skirmish from above. These enemies, if not skipped altogether, encourage the player to use Torrent to speed around the outskirts of the fight and pick off the soldiers using the dodgy horseback combat while praying they don't get smacked off their horse. For a veteran or intermediate player, this doesn't really seem all that difficult, but I want to make something clear. The difficulty presented by a set piece in FromSoft's games doesn't dictate the overall quality of said set piece. Things like enemy placement, enemy type, the information given to the player, and the tools at their disposal are all things that need to be accounted for. Difficulty is only one factor that needs to be studied, and like all things related to FromSoftware, isn't always the factor that should get the most attention, assuming what we're talking about is meant to be well designed. That said, difficulty is the only thing the developers seem to care about when designing this horrific display of skill tests and gameplay. I understand they wanted to show that the player was leaving the newbie area somehow, but seriously. 3 crossbowmen, supported by long-ranged attacks and a giant to boot. The game is already showing its hand at this moment, and I remember specifically sighing in preparation for the rest of the games being built this way, and it's a good thing I did, because 150 hours of this shit wears a man down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What's the issue with this set piece, exactly? First of all, 3 range units isn't an inherently flawed skirmish to design, at least as a base, but when you throw in the addition of a giant and ask the player to defend his or herself from its onslaught while also dodging the arrows, you're only testing the player so much in their skill until it becomes a game of either running through and away from the fight itself, which is admittedly a classic tactic in FromSoft games, but one that should usually be used when you already have a firm understanding of the battle in front of you. Or you can simply continue to play Ring Around the Rosie with the giant while accounting for the bolts being fired at you from multiple angles. Now, most players might say that you should just go for the range units first if it's that big a problem, but that's not exactly a wise strategy either, since out of the fucking ether comes a handful of soldiers protecting them, and here's where the poor design of this small set piece shows itself. It isn't trying to test the player's critical thinking skills, stealth abilities, or strategy. It's literally just saying, let's see how well you run around. Obviously, we come to the final conclusion then that the player should hop onto Torrent and begin slashing away at enemies at high speeds. As aforementioned, the combat featured on horseback isn't exactly bad, but it's not the focus point of the game, and FromSoftware limited its usefulness accordingly. You can slash to the right and left, and it's a tad unresponsive, and even with the talisman boosting horseback damage, is usually meant for quickly dispatching enemies that are inconveniencing you along your travels. As a solution to this skirmish, it's not only a weak option, but the best option, and also one that spells out the bind that FromSoftware has put themselves in with Elden Ring's foundations. Look at it this way, the player has just acquired a mount and is now likely going to want to try it out. So, FromSoft puts this long highway in front of them and decides to throw enemies alongside it. This way, the player can dig into the speed of Torrent while also getting a taste of fighting on horseback. But, how do you design the skirmishes the player should come across beyond the gatefront? Well, you can try placing an archer here and there, but that might seem a tad too easy on the player. After all, Torrent is so fast, dodging 1 or 2 bolts isn't all that hard. So, you throw a giant right in the player's path, right on top of an item they're likely to pick up, so that they are either slow to react, or holding still altogether when the giant makes its entrance. But then that doesn't exactly solve the problem of difficulty, because the player can still gallop beyond the giant and clean up the crossbowmen before returning to the giant, which, in theory, should be a simple series of strategies to employ, even with the clunky horse combat. So FromSoft decided to just chuck in a handful of soldiers to protect the crossbowmen and call it a day. Except now, instead of the player having to calmly assess the situation and figure out the best way to manage their crowd control skills, they're just left with the realization that it's infinitely better in the name of using their time wisely to fuck off and continue up the highway. The reality is that having 1 or 2 ranged opponents harass you while you manage a larger, slower opponent would have been just fine, especially since you have full view of the ranged opponents ahead of time and can accurately account for missile speed and the number of opponents you have to think about. The choice between fighting the giant while juking the missiles or going after the crossbowmen would have been a good introduction to proper crowd control for a new player, and actually would have almost pound for pound resembled another fight from Dark Souls 1 that actually managed to deliver this kind of set piece, but with far greater design at the forefront. The final takeaway from this small fight is that FromSoft has given tools to the player that make creating set pieces in the open world extremely difficult to balance properly, given the amount of mobility that Torrent brings into the game. Fine, whatever, just get past the fight, right? Well, actually no, that isn't fine, and there is something else that needs to be talked about here. Summoning. It isn't entirely likely that the player up to this point would have unlocked both a summoning ash and the bell required to use them, but if they had, they could summon them to help deal with this fight properly. Summoning is a mechanic that's been in the Dark Souls games since the first. It's a function that allows players to bring in other players or NPCs to help with boss fights. This is certainly a measure that was put into place primarily to help weaker players accomplish feats in a timely pace without getting overwhelmed with practicing 3 hours a day, but also to allow PvE players to engage in jolly cooperation where it would otherwise seem like PvP is the only option for player-to-player interaction. That said, up until Elden Ring, with a few notable exceptions, FromSoftware has never used the cooperation interaction to rely on their game design. Every boss was designed with one player in mind, with a cooperation option off to the side in case that proved too difficult for some, or if the player wanted to farm certain rewards for engaging in co-op gameplay. This meant that every boss fight, no matter how difficult, was always designed with one player in mind and had next to no chance at being poorly designed due to bouncing around multiple people. That doesn't mean every fight that was designed this way was well designed. Understand? It just means that it wouldn't be designed poorly because of the bouncing centered around multiple players fighting one boss. Well, Elden Ring took that idea, and as we can see with this highway encounter, is openly lighting it on fire. I understand that Giant isn't actually a boss here, but for new players he might as well be. The whole idea here is to give the player a reason to summon NPCs to take the aggro, while the player runs around and tries to mop up as many enemies as they can before their summoned allies die. This is the kind of gameplay I'd expect from playing Bannerlord, for example, not a FromSoft game where the whole draw of the combat is to experiment with different builds while learning the rhythm of your opponent's attack patterns. What is there to be learned with this scenario? If you summon allies for help, you're just speedrunning a hack and slash game, and if you don't, you're showcasing your horse racing skills. The reason I'm spending so much time on this, to reiterate, isn't because this one set piece ruins Elden Ring, or that a player can't have fun at this part of the game. It's because the design of this section is that of the spam bush variety you can see plain as day exhibited in Dark Souls 2, which is a design philosophy that's been overwhelmingly attacked and maligned by FromSoft fans since the game's inception. As I've stated, this is just one problem in Elden Ring, but the biggest issue, aside from it existing at all, is that it doesn't go away or crop up just every once in a while. It's a fundamental form of difficulty balancing that FromSoft not only leans on like a crutch in this fucking game, but is also comfortable enough to throw in the player's face right at the start. It's going to get annoying hearing me repeat myself, but this problem will only compound on the others. It will never go away. After moving beyond the highway spam bush, the player will either find the Crucible Knight, explore the side of the cliff ahead of them for some extra loot, travel straight to Margit, or will explore beyond the Stormville Castle near the Finger Reader, and may very well skip the castle altogether as an optional area. There is also an NPC to meet who will hand off an Ash summons. As for the extra loot given to the player who chooses to explore, I think there is no controversy in saying that Elden Ring is reminiscent of Morrowind in the way that it can hook a player that takes some time to do extra searching. While both games can send a player straight through the main questline with absolutely zero extra work on the part of the player beyond just following the directions given by the game, both games also let the player know very early on that you can reap incredible rewards by taking the unbeaten path, or by simply keeping an eye out for seemingly unremarkable places. The sheer amount of loot to be gained by exploring is something that the game wears on its sleeve as an asset, and it definitely is an asset. I mean, it's one of the best parts of the game. Exploring to find some crafting material that'll make your favorite item, or get a new weapon that becomes your favorite, or just finding a random boss off to the side of the map. It's a lot of fun, at least in the beginning of the game, when everything is new and you're not seeing the same things over and over again. But that's a point for later. For now, let's focus on the Crucible Knight. The Crucible Knight is likely the first Evergale boss the average player is going to find. Also, people have been pronouncing this word Evergale or Everjoel. I'm pronouncing it Evergale, and it's probably wrong, but I like it. These are bosses that are confined to an instanced area that are all identical to one another and easily identifiable on the map. The fights themselves range from uninspired and boring to highly engaging and innovative. The Crucible Knight sits somewhere in between. He certainly has his difficulty slider turned way down as a means to give the new player enough comfortability to train without actually trying to cheese him. His attacks are forgivingly telegraphed, his HP bar isn't all that large, and he usually doesn't kill you in one move or sets of moves like later enemies tend to. All in all, he's a decent fight, and most players with most builds probably won't think twice about the guy. But he does present the opportunity to talk about another huge issue with the game's design: pace. Ever since Demon's Souls, players have been getting better and better at solving the FromSoft formula, and as a result, the game's boss fights, and fights in general, have been getting faster and faster as a means to test the player with a fresh new coat of difficulty. That's fine. I see it as a natural progression of design most franchises take. But the problem is that this increased pace across the board isn't properly accounted for with many of the build archetypes FromSoft puts into their games. For instance, one of my playthroughs features a build with this Zweihander, a colossal sword that's known for having high poise damage and very slow attacks. It hits like a truck and turns like one too, understand? The problem is, I found myself unable to make use of its high poise damage against the Crucible Knight because, despite the boss himself being fairly moderately paced in terms of the way he changes attacks together, I only ever had time to stab him after rolling out of the way of one of his attacks, leading to a repetitive roll R1 attack pattern that not only didn't stagger the guy to any reliable degree but caused very little DPS. You'll notice, again, that this isn't a difficulty issue. This is simply a strange balancing problem wherein the game itself has become too fast for many of the solutions that it offers the player to be considered viable, unless you enjoy taking 300% more time to kill bosses while repeating the same move over and over and over again. And this issue only gets worse during the second half of the boss fight when Mr. Crucible begins cosplaying as a cat girl and swipes at you with his tail, a move that was surely designed to catch new players off guard, but one that ultimately just serves as a buffer after his normal moveset to further diminish the time allotted to the player to make an offensive counterattack. With a heavy weapon, you absolutely must wait for this tail swipe too, because if you choose to try and get away with a jab, his AI will 100% of the time punish you for it, and your slow recovery speed won't allow you to dodge out of the way even when positioned ideally to do so. I mean, the attack was designed to be fast, and I get that, but he activates it faster than he's normally able to even recover naturally from his regular attack. That is to say, before he's able to even recover his stance from a normal attack, he's suddenly able to swing his tail at you just as a way to punish the player for trying to dish out some damage. The worst part is, this attack isn't always a sure thing. He may very well size you up, see that you're not trying to hit him, and recover naturally, which means you then have to wait for another set of attacks before dodging away from his cattail, which may or may not come, before then quickly jabbing the guy for minimal poise and health damage. Again, not strictly a difficulty issue. It isn't difficult. At least, not to me. Nothing about this screams too hard, and in fact, I just parried the guy to death, so it didn't matter much anyway. But it was kind of unfortunate to know that if I wanted to make use of the new guard counter mechanic to get bosses to stagger, I was going to have to trade HP to do it, instead of just swinging it at opportune times like normal. And for any bosses that weren't parryable, I was probably going to have to chip away at their health slowly, despite having a sword designed to cause massive damage in short bursts. Finishing up with Cat Knight, which gives a pretty cool, albeit weak reward, players can skip the castle altogether or take on Margit. I'm sure many players who managed to find the side path to skip this area didn't take it, out of curiosity for the castle. But the fact that the game gives players that option is something I like. Player choice, especially in the context of Elden Ring's narrative, is many times a great feature in games, and Elden Ring is no exception. The game very rarely forces your hand, and that's a strong asset for a game as large as Elden Ring to have. As for Margit, there isn't much to say except that I think he's a well-designed boss. A mix of fast and slow attacks, about as perfectly sized an HP bar as a boss at this area in the game should have, in my opinion, some alternate forms of damage, great voice acting, and interesting aesthetics. I have nothing bad to say about the guy except that the path leading up to him is yet another horde of spambush enemies that are placed around to hassle you into giving in and just summoning some AI to help take off the heat. This is an area that is not more than a few minutes from the ranged units and giant set piece, and already the game is throwing that same design at you again. This is the equivalent of FromSoftware saying, yeah, this is here to stay, get used to it. I'm sure the justification for this being that you can just crouch down and avoid a lot of the overall battle by picking off the horn callers while stealthed. But I don't honestly see that as a justification for this kind of fight when almost every single skirmish in the open world portion of the game is designed with a huge number of enemies in mind. It's almost like they gave players an accessible solution to spambush in the form of stealth to make their skirmish design less horrific and called it a day. Except that only leaves players with the option to either A, spend extra time crouch walking up to isolated enemies, or B, spend extra time running around to avoid the horde in comic fashion. This is to say nothing of the role-playing aspects of feeling pressured into being stealthy when not a stealth character, or summoning AI assistance when you'd rather be a solo character and try to get through the game on your own, at the detriment of your own sanity. But, as we'll come to learn and discuss at length, Elden Ring, yeah, it's not a role-playing game, but for now, back to Margit. After defeating him, players gain access to Stormveil Castle and will probably be introduced to the round table held by Melina. I should say up to this point that I've been very specific with each area and what it has to offer, but I'm going to be speaking more and more generally moving forward, and especially for large set pieces like Stormveil Castle, which represent traditional Dark Souls level design more than they do open world areas, I'll be talking about their strengths and weaknesses in a general sense, as opposed to pointing out every little thing a player can do. One, this makes it probably more enjoyable to listen to, and also I'm fucking lazy. Here, the player will storm Stormy Castle either by being slaughtered by a fuck ton of mounted ballistas or by going up the side of the castle, which has seen better days. Most players will opt for the side of the castle and work their way back after the fact to collect any loot left behind. Stormveil Castle features some very nice shortcut-friendly design, hidden areas with extra boss fights, NPCs to meet, and ends with a solid boss fight against Godric. It plays well with its verticality and opens the player's mind up to the possibilities of using the improved jumping function. All in all, it's a great area, though for some reason it takes this greatness and mars it by placing a metric fuck ton of enemies on ranged, mounted weaponry anywhere that resembles an open field. Honestly, this is pretty easy to circumnavigate, especially since you can just avoid most of the ranged attacks you'll face by going around the main stairs. But the fact that the only way to grab the loot in the center of the field is by either sprinting through the entire place like a madman, or by tediously dealing with each and every fuck-off enemy is a bit of a letdown in an otherwise strong area of the game. This is doubly true for gaining access to the tower that allows Godric's rune to be activated, which sees you potentially run past ballistas on top of crossbowmen, a speedy pup, and a handful of 99 range PvPers wearing full void to boot. But again, this isn't that big of a deal on its own, and in fact the area is far stronger than it is weak in this regard. But it is still an ugly part of Stormveil Castle where it otherwise looks quite nice after about everything that you've been through. The fight with Godric in particular is one of those fights I wish the game had more of. No, he wasn't parryable as far as I could tell, which is a personal disappointment of mine. But he does test every ability of the player, from dodging ranged attacks, adapting to fast, slow, and AoE movesets, dealing with a high amount of mobility, and yes, attempting to damage his poise. Praise the Lord. Although, speaking of poise, this fight does introduce an opportunity to talk about another fundamental problem with Elden Ring, and that is the R2 jump attack. I've heard many people say that they felt the game does a good job of mixing the kinds of attacks a player feels they should apply for certain situations. I disagree. As is the case with fighting Godric, many of the fights in Elden Ring feel as though simply jumping into an R2 attack to maximize poise damage and, subsequently, maximize overall DPS is simply the best option in 99% of situations where you have time to do it. Do you have time to do a jump attack? Do a jump attack. Do you not have time to do a jump attack? Stop using the fucking colossal swords, you dummy. The game allows you to fight every enemy however you want, assuming you have the health and resources to trade with them when performing moves or spells that require tanking hits. But overall, you're just better off jumping and R2ing them. Jump, R2, jump, R2, jump, R2. This is true even against enemies that seem to be designed around guard countering, since guard countering is reliant on your opponent making the moves you want as opposed to you taking the initiative yourself. Again, I'm not saying you can't utilize multiple movesets, I'm just saying there isn't a vast array of viability here. Jump, attack, jump, attack. That's your viability if you want to help yourself, and really is your best option in almost every situation where there is time to employ it. And as long as you're not using a slow weapon, almost every situation does give you the same amount of opportunities to jump attack as they do any other kind of move that isn't a quick jab. Do you know how annoying it is to have to play around jumping like an Italian plumber with a sword? It looks and feels ridiculous. But it's every melee character's objectively strongest option unless they're using larger weaponry, which is fairly ass backwards since large weapons are hardly sought after specifically because of their potential poise damage. And even then, you can use large weaponry, but you just have to expect that you're going to trade HP for it. Which, given how much damage is in the game and how quickly the opponents just destroy you, trading health is really, really dangerous in Elden Ring. Especially when you compare it to the previous Dark Souls games where you could actually take a hit and then just heal back up. This only half dips its toes into problems with pacing on certain occasions, but it's all the time a representation of the inconsistency with poise damage and normal attacks and the overtuned nature of poise damage and jump attack. This problem certainly doesn't apply to smaller enemies that die in just a few hits, but against every boss you aren't one-shotting, it's an obvious issue that you're going to notice if you're paying any attention. It's just another problem to stack on the few we've gone over, really. Overall, Godric as a fight and Stormvale Castle as an area are strong portions of the game, even with the aforementioned problems. Liurnia of the Lakes encompasses what I'd call the entering the mid-game area of Elden Ring, which is comprised of 3 key areas. One long landmass to the left, one long landmass to the right, and one gigantic lake slapped right in the middle of the two. The structure of this particular area of the game is something I think works in favor of Liurnia. Players are probably going to take notice of the fact that the route through the center leads to the larger part of the rest of the game's geography, while the side paths lead to abrupt stops. At least this is the obvious case with the leftmost landmass. This means that players are basically being told ahead of time where their hours are best spent if they want to continue on with the main part of the game, and where they can go if they want some extra sauce, which is particularly important since I believe this part of the game is where most players are going to feel their patience tested. The right side of Liurnia is a stretch of cliffside littered with opponents that are more or less designed to harass you while you farm up the resources that have been placed along your path. Ranged robots, ghostly fighters, and a magic skeleton man in a boat that teleports wherever the fuck he wants. Is this part of the game difficult? No. Not particularly, I just find it annoying that I'm being asked to take part in this hack and slash game when I want to be playing an open world Dark Souls game, but whatever, to each their own. And I understand that some people are probably thinking, hey, I actually enjoyed this part of the game and you're not bringing any objective arguments into this portion of the video, you're just complaining. And that's fair enough. I find this right side of Liurnia annoying and dull, and that's true for the NPC battle encounter and the catacombs you can find here. I feel like this portion of the game could have been packed into a tinier landmass with the same amount of enemies and would have played more to the game's hack and slash strengths without making the player journey on and on with Torrent to the point of autopilot. But honestly, that could be said for the entirety of the game, so whatever. Central Lake itself is probably the most empty area in the entire game, aside from the desert where the Star Scourge resides, but is littered with crafting resources that I commend you for going out of your way to get since you're not going to be using them outside of gimmick gameplay. Despite being more empty than the left and rightmost landmasses, I feel the lake in the center of Liurnia is still stronger than the 2 side areas, simply because of its unique aesthetics, and also because of the fact that it's what leads you to the Academy of Rea Lucaria. The Academy is located smack dab in the middle of Liurnia, and I could not wait to get into it every single playthrough I did of this game. Not because it's amazing, but because its decency is a much needed break from Liurnia's poor quality as an area overall. For my first playthrough, I spent a lot of time checking out each and every area of Liurnia to better understand it. For each playthrough thereafter, I rushed towards the dragon that guards the Academy Gate Key, and... Actually, you know what? Let's stop and talk about the fucking dragon real quick. And when I say that dragon, I basically mean every dragon in the game. They're all the same as this one, except instead of magic breath, they throw out alternate forms of damage. They all have the same movesets and habits, and I'd reckon outside of a few exceptions, they are all just copy-pasted forms of each other with alternate color schemes and breath. And this dragon fight, let me fucking tell you, is yet another example of FromSoft's bind with Torrent's existence. Because you can ride on a horse's back, it seems FromSoft decided to just program this dragon to fuck off into oblivion so that you can chase it down. Listen guys, chasing this dragon, okay, it isn't difficult. It ain't even a second thought. My grandmother could chase this dragon down without getting hit by its long-range attacks, and she's been dead for years. Why make us chase this dragon around the lake when all it does is provide a fake difficulty multiplier by taking more time from the player? Well, I'd argue that taking more time from the player's pocket is the only content that Elden Ring consistently provides, but let's take things a little softer. Maybe attacking this dragon fight's design is a bit harsh, since it's optional, for one, and also likely FromSoftware's first attempt at incorporating mount combat into a boss fight ever. So maybe attacking it like it should be perfect is a bit like going back to Demon Souls and complaining that the combat isn't as fast as Sekiro's, right? It's a boundary that FromSoft is pushing, so I'm half wanting to criticize it and half wanting to give them a pass, because it's new, and this is a very unique game in the fact that it has mounted combat. So I'm not sure if I should actually hate this shit or not. I don't know. I don't know. This script has taken me like 3 months. Over 3 months, and I still don't fucking know. I've played the game for about 200 hours, and I still don't know. I don't like it. I guess it's just meh. It's just so fucking boring. I fucking hate it. You know what? No, I hate it. Never mind. Fuck this dragon fight, alright? Flying away at Mach speed over and over and over again. Also, I forgot to mention that the attacks it puts out are such fucking bullshit, okay? I don't mind getting stomped and chomped and magic to death because these are all things I can account for, right? But this fucking, look at this backwards blue breath everywhere, hope you weren't in the middle of a swing move that this Drake can do, actually makes me want to go 3-tick fish for 100 hours so that I can experience something that's slightly less awful than this fight. This point actually brings me back to the pacing issue, since those of you who fought this Drake with a large colossal weapon would understand as well as I do that there are some situations where this Drake will one-hit kill you for trying to get a hit in just because your RNG decided that it was time to do this backwards magic breath move. Oh my god, this move. Up, backwards, and magic breath. Apparently this combo is the most deadly thing in all of Elden Ring. I don't know why the Drake doesn't just repeat this move over and over again. He'd never fucking die. Hell, this Drake could become Elden Lord. Just do this move against every foe he ever faces. And I can hear you saying, if you don't want to die to a surprise attack, just level Vigor. I hear your point about being forced to level a specific stat to be able to play the game, and I raise you a response about what it means to be a role-playing game right now. Off to the eastern side of the lake, you can find a dungeon. And in this dungeon are some enemies. They're fine, but the boss fight. Holy hell, the fucking boss fight. Remember how I said that Elden Ring isn't an RPG? Well, here's an example of why. This boss fight is between some crystal foes. Some foes that are made of crystal. Where most enemies who have resistances against specific damage types are harder to kill using those specific damage types, the Crystallian bosses, of which there are multiple instances of across the map elsewhere, are next to immune from any damage type they aren't specifically weak to. If you aren't using Strike or Blood Loss, you're not dealing damage to the Blue Man group. It just isn't happening. I'm talking like less than 5% of their total HP individually when attacking with something they aren't weak to. This means that if you, like me, were up to this point role-playing as a dagger-wielding mage, you are completely fucked, unless you are willing to break character and use a strike weapon. Awesome! I mean, it isn't difficult to upgrade other weapons, right? The game throws so many upgrade materials at you, it might as well be DS2. And there are so many different kinds of strike weapons in the game that you have plenty to choose from. So what's my problem with this? Well, this isn't an objective problem, but the way I see it, it is strong evidence against calling Elden Ring a role-playing game at all, since you're not actually role-playing. You're just not role-playing. If you can upgrade tons of weapons, have to use all kinds of different weapons depending on the situation, and have to actively break a character's role when playing the game is not a role-playing one. It's one wherein you use all of its facets to blaze through its content. In other words, the game not only punishes you for role-playing, but effectively tells you that you can't play all of its content unless you become a character that's willing to bite the bullet and play with all of the tools available to you. This is not what we call a role-playing game. This is what we call a fantasy action-adventure game. This isn't a negative for everyone, I understand, and for those who aren't really into role-playing games to begin with, I know that hearing criticism towards Elden Ring's ability to give you options is confusing, if not outright ridiculous. But in a game that stems from actual role-playing games and advertises itself as a role-playing game, it's incredibly disappointing to be hit with the realization that this game isn't actually made for role-playing. And as long as people, and FromSoftware, continue to call it an RPG, I'm going to continue criticizing it for not being one, or, alternatively, being a poorly made one that actively punishes players for trying to play in a specific manner without breaking character. But like I said, maybe most players aren't even going to think twice about being forced to tech into strike or bleed weaponry, nor are they going to care about having to level Vigor in order to avoid being surprise one-tapped by a dragon's speediest of moves. And maybe most players aren't going to mind their weak, low Vigor, sneaky mage picking up two-handed maces once in a while to overcome a side dungeon. To each their own, I suppose. I'll quickly digress to finish off this chapter by saying that the Academy proves to be an area of the game with some of the coolest designs in Elden Ring. aesthetically speaking. The verticality experienced when traversing the rooftops and avoiding the mini Sen's Fortress callback is a great addition, and the enemy design is extraordinarily memorable. Aside from aesthetics, the Academy proves to be mediocre, with a lot of its content pushing the spam bush button with ranged harassment and a boss fight that, after burning through its harassment design yet again, rewards you with one of the most undercooked great runes in the game. To the left of the Academy and the final main area featured near Liurnia is a path on the left landmass that leads to the Karya Manor, a magically infused and protected castle that has hands that I dare you to spend time learning how to fight, and a boss fight reminiscent of the Tree Sentinel one found at the beginning of the game, except with a lot more magical harassment, and that's really all there is to say about that. Beyond this fight lies the introduction to the Round questline and another dragon fight, which takes place on terrain that was almost certainly not originally intended to have a dragon AI move around on it, right? Look at this footage, this fucking guy is not meant to be just... The AI can't function on the terrain. I've complained about the dragons enough, so I'm just going to move on. The Weeping Peninsula is an area of the game that I imagine most players would be split into finding, depending on how early or late they arrived at this part of the map. Strictly speaking, it isn't exactly paced so that players would happen upon it in the second half of their playthrough, but I can absolutely see people moving beyond a good portion of the game in one direction before backtracking and finding this isolated area. For the people who did find it late, I imagine their impressions of the Weeping Peninsula would be that it was an area of the game designed as a sort of break from the challenge of the rest of the game. Almost like a secondary addition to the starting area that was made for people who wanted to checkmark a part of the game quickly and feel like they've made a great deal of progress in exploring an entire area's continent. Continent? An entire area's content. For players who found this part of the map before exploring onwards to Liurnia or Caelid, the experience was probably only slightly different in that the difficulty would have been understandably higher, taking an otherwise compact area and making it seem a bit larger due to the average amount of playtime to complete it being longer. All in all, the Weeping Peninsula does suffer from a number of issues in minor form, such as spam bush enemy placement and finicky AI, but it doesn't relish in these problems all that much, and given its smaller nature, it actually acts as a very nice addition to the game for players to go and complete when they feel like they need an area that's relaxing to explore before continuing on with the rest of their journey. After making good on one's desire to leave behind Liurnia, a player will find a miner's cave to the north along a narrow pathway marked by the lake's turn into a running river. The cavern will supply the player with a healthy amount of upgrade materials and some cheeky ambush experiences, courtesy of the Flamios. Beyond the cavern, the player will arrive at this chapter's focus, the ruin-strewn precipice. This here precipice is strewn with ruin. Also, it houses some of the most gorgeous scenery and vocal performances in the game. That second part isn't a joke either. The precipice is one of the many areas of the game that's home to the singing bad NPC which performs Song of Lament. Song of Lament, without any hint of irony, has single-handedly made me put down my controller and sit for 5 minutes at a time to take in this beauty of a piece. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I'd actually be surprised to hear that not every player was taken aback by its somewhat out-of-place quality. Many might disagree with me on this, but I personally feel as though the soundtrack of this game is lackluster, both for boss fight pieces and for music associated with the open world. That said, Song of Lament acts as a hard counter to this argument all on its own, and is complemented with a unique tie to the game's lore and interacts with a specific enemy to boot. It's the first big reason I wanted to talk about the precipice, simply because there aren't too many points in the game where you'd find Song of Lament playing, and it was something I'd have to address at one point or another. The second reason is the boss fight that marks the end of the area, just before the Altus Plateau. Magma Worm Makar. As a one-time boss, I think Magma Worm Makar is a subpar HP train that is easy to understand and easier to maneuver around. His design is predictable and his moveset is mostly underwhelming, a bit like the Gaping Dragon and Quelaag from DS1 combined. Makar acts as a checkpoint boss in between a player's journey from Liurnia to the Altus Plateau. His moveset plays around his ability to charge the player down in chubby fashion while marking off certain points of the arena with magma. So, not only is he applying the Elden Ring dragon tactic of running away from you, but he also irks my sense of time by not allowing me to catch back up to him when he does finish his cardio for the day. Honestly, I could understand those who think I'm just complaining about this for no reason if Makar was actually a one-time boss. Really, if he showed up once, really, I would say, oh, this boss isn't that great, whatever, not a problem. He's just one of the many forgettable, right? But the problem is that you have to fight copy and pasted versions of him multiple times throughout your journey through Mount Gelmir. So these problems multiply over and over upon themselves. And after the second fight with pasted Makar, which takes place on terrain that he simply does not agree with, much like the dragon fight near Rani, I became distraught over the thought of seeing yet another one of him at any point of my playthrough. In short, he's not a very good boss on the first go, since his mobility and charge techniques inspire fighting him on horseback, except actually trading blows with him requires being on foot to do so reliably, and the experience only sours from there each time you see him, a not so good way to end ruin-strewn precipice's otherwise enchanting display.
But you can't have everything all the time, I suppose. As I write this script, this very sentence, I'm stuck at a crossroads with how to proceed with this video. I spent about 1 hour today trying to play this game, and as I came across the Altus Plateau for the 5th or 6th time, which lay barren with some of the most copy-pasted designs you could imagine for a game, I realized that the hour ahead of me, for which I was previously planning on being roughly 4, was going to be a poor one. Altus Plateau wastes no time in showing you its cards, and at the very same time holds one of the coolest surprises the player could hope to find. Initially, the player is met with a host of what we'll call tanky fucks. The technical term in game design for when a developer really wants it to throw a number of enemies with moderate to severe health pools into a game. The tanky fucks are tanky, and they hit like trucks. I recommend no one take a break from playing Elden Ring by fighting them. Ahead of the plateau's tanky fucks is a dragon. A boss dragon. This boss fight is the first unique dragon fight that I had come across in the game, and is usually the second or third one I fought in my playthroughs. It's got an incredible introduction, a nice move set, and doesn't run 10 miles away from the player every time someone approaches him with a trade offer. That said, its one great downfall is that you can't fight it. The dragon disappears if you move too far away or get its health too low. It's a shame, but at least Elden Ring gave me a taste of fun to keep me from turning off the game entirely. A shame yet further is the fact that this dragon fight, which you do not participate in to the end, is arguably the height of Altus Plateau's ensemble. The rest of the area, mostly, is a litter of empty space, hordes of enemies you've already seen, and encampments, which, again, you've already seen. The one true exception to this rule, and the one extraordinarily amazing part of Altus Plateau that I wish there was more of in Elden Ring, is the Godskin Apostle atop the north side of the plateau. Yes, the Apostle is the same one you fight in the Caelid Wilds, and, of course, the same one from the horrific duo fight that we have yet to get to. But it also represents a boss fight that's enriched with lore and atmosphere that I fully enjoyed, and after taking part in, realized that I had been missing that with the rest of Elden Ring's gameplay up till that point. It wasn't that I hadn't seen any lore-surrounded content to this point in the game. It's that this Apostle encounter was so strong in its delivery to the player that I was absolutely blown away by it, and as a result realized just how weak everything else I had been playing up till then was. All things considered, this Apostle encounter isn't even that good by FromSoft standards, in my opinion. I think it's a weak version of the Dancer fight from Dark Souls 3, with most of the difficulty and none of the gorgeous aesthetic. Not a bad fight by any means, this Apostle encounter, but not great either. And problematically, also one of the stronger points into the open world portion of the game. Walking through a seemingly functioning town in this otherwise chaotic world only to find cultists who seem to worship the Godskins was a thrilling experience. Finding the little tidbits of info regarding what kind of celebration was happening made me more enthralled with the Godskins and how they interacted with the world. It's also true that I completely forgot about them shortly after leaving this part of the game and made haste to get to Mount Gelmir. I should say, actually, as a parting glass to the plateau, that it also has an Evergale encounter with Godric the Grafted. The boss you would have already beaten at this point, but without the sweet cinematic, and also you have already beaten him at this point, so what the fuck is he doing here? Also, it isn't actually Godric, it's Godfrey the Grafted, with all the same movesets as Godric and everything. Oy vavoy, FromSoft, please stop, I'm so fucking done. Why the hell is every enemy who's even slightly unique copy and pasted everywhere in this fucking game? Why am I looking at Godric for a second time here? I realize that there's probably a lore-friendly reason for this definitely not Godric thing to be here, but that doesn't mean it should be here. If you're going to make a copy and pasted boss fight of Godric, just fucking do it, FromSoft, or instead, actually make his kin a different boss fight entirely instead of just T-bow spawning the boss in random ass parts of the map. This is true for almost every single boss fight in this game, and hell on wheels, how is Godric at the very least not protected from this replica variant form of game design? Out of all the bosses that FromSoft could have chucked in this Evergale, they chose the one that people would have run into first, and one of the most iconic in the game. And how? And why? Why? That's like the biggest question for this game. Why? Why the hell is the movement janky in Elden Ring, you know? You'd think after so many iterations of the formula, FromSoft would have nailed the movement system on the head with this game, and yet it's reverted in very many small ways back to a worse design. Take a look at this clip of me moving very naturally forward in a swaying motion in Dark Souls 1. My character moves smoothly from side to side with no alteration to my inputs. Using that same kind of input in Dark Souls 2, you can see the ever-disgusting altered method of movement, which takes the player's input and alters it at certain angles to make differences in the movement during small turns even more minute, but also overcorrects for itself during large changes of angle and throws my character's direction way further across than I intended for. You can think of this movement system as a snap system, with a limited number of directions of true movement when facing any which way. I think that this might have been put in place to reduce the effect that dead zones and controllers have on the Dark Souls gameplay, but ultimately just served as a constant annoyance to DS2 players. In strange happenstance, the good movement design in Dark Souls 1 that is displayed here is thrown out the window when you lock onto an enemy. which then sets your player's movements to a snap system not too dissimilar to Dark Souls 2. Likewise, DS2's normal snap method of movement gets tossed out the window when you lock onto an enemy and turns into Dark Souls 1 method of free movement. In simple terms, both games got one aspect of movement wrong. With Dark Souls 3's release, though, we got a Dark Souls game that got both methods done correctly, in that your character is completely free to move however it likes, regardless if it's locked onto an enemy or not. You'd think that that would be the last time we'd ever have to complain about basic movement in FromSoft games, but nay, nay, nay. Look here at the same exact Dark Souls 1 footage from earlier, paired with the same inputs in Elden Ring. Notice that strange snapping my character on the right is taking part in? Okay, it's super minute, but it's there. Instead of having what appears to be full 360 degrees of freedom like Mr. DS1 over here, Mr. Elden Ring is jankily and ever so slightly snapping from left to right as though he's constantly clipping through something. And I just don't understand why. Why? It's such a tiny annoyance that I'm sure most players didn't even notice it. But why, FromSoft? Why would you do this? Is it related to netcode? Is it related to PvP and server performance? Is taking the Dark Souls 3 formula and making it slightly worse just something you really wanted to do here? It may very well be, since that's basically what you did with this entire fucking game. Oh, and don't forget about the horse movement. I get that mounted combat and its mechanics in general are a feat to be celebrated, given the fact that it's FromSoft's first attempt. But how many players can honestly say they didn't have multiple experiences where they were very simply trying to descend from an area that is designed to be descended from and ended up just killing themselves because the weird clunky rotational mechanics of Torrent not wanting to change direction without some forward momentum first. It's a petty point to bring up, but a point nonetheless. You're on your horse so often, it just feels gross. Also, why the hell is the balancing in the game so strange? It's not necessarily always bad, and some of the times it feels just right. But it's all the time strange. You know what I mean? Why is that? When you're killing a boss you found off to the side of the map somewhere, can you really honestly say that you were ever sure if you were supposed to be at that boss when you were? I sure as hell couldn't. Beyond any early game bosses, I never really knew if I was dealing too much or too little damage to the bosses I was contesting. And I think that's because of the non-linear design of the map meshing poorly with the very much linear scaling of the enemies in the world. In previous FromSoft games, you didn't need to worry too much about which enemies you should be fighting and which ones you shouldn't, because they were all designed around you taking a natural path through the game. You could fight late game enemies early, if you wanted to, but it was never a necessity or something you'd often be forced to do. Take for instance the skeleton graveyard right next to the Firelink Shrine in DS1. Yeah, a new player could attempt to clear it out and get some wicked hot base cannon action, but more than likely, they were going to see how tanky the skeletons were, compare that with how weak the undead are who are littered along the path towards the undead burg, and just follow the game path as intended. The same logic can be applied to players who went to the New Londo ruins and found themselves up against the locked gate and a bunch of invulnerable ghosties who, even if beaten, guarded yet another locked gate area that the player just wouldn't be able to progress through without the Ring of Puppies. The caveat here being that in Dark Souls 1, the open world nature of the game meant that any of these paths and more with the right knowledge could be taken advantage of. And even if a player didn't know what they were doing, they were bound to take advantage of this open world design anyway through shortcuts and alternate, sometimes hidden paths through the world. And I say the open world design from Dark Souls 1 very intentionally. Most people think that Elden Ring might have been FromSoft's first open world game, and that's really not true. Dark Souls 1 is absolutely an open world game, and it's designed far better than Elden Ring in that respect. It's compact, it doesn't waste your time, and it has a lot of interconnected parts. That's a word you're going to hear a lot when you look at Dark Souls 1 reviews, interconnected world. But it's true. It's a point that's been run into the ground, but it is true. Dark Souls 1, it connects its worlds just so well. I'm like, just thinking about it makes me want to go fucking play the game right now instead of doing a review on this piece of shit. Elden Ring is also open world, but Elden Ring just doesn't respect the player. Everything is wide. You can go play Dark Souls 1 right now and get treated to a really well done, handcrafted, intentional open world that is interconnected. Okay? Or you can play Elden Ring and get more shit to do, but just over and over again. And it's going to waste your time. And it's going to be spread out over just an unnecessarily large map. An unnecessarily empty, repetitive, disgusting large map. Ugh, fucking hell. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, the paths before the player are way less interconnected than Dark Souls 1 and far more linear, but still serve this type of scaling enemy power extremely well, because the designers know where you're going to be at every step of the game, so they can plan accordingly. In Elden Ring, the player has to cipher all the information regarding balance out for themselves and in the worst way possible. by getting to a point in the game that was clearly just not for their level and leaving to go try and find the right place to be at. This isn't a game like Morrowind, where a task that is too difficult to complete is an integral part of the game's narrative and structure, and where every location in the game has something for you to do, regardless of why you're there. This is Elden Ring. And in Elden Ring, you are either wasting your time hacking away at a boss's ungodly fucking HP bar, or you are wasting your time absolutely smothering a boss you were meant to fight 10 levels prior. Very rarely will a first-time player find anything in between. This problem of balance extends to the weapons as well. Not only are you tasked with mobbing groups of enemies who require specific damage types to practically kill, but you're tasked with maintaining the necessary weapons and the respective stat requirements to do so at all times. And these weapons range from mostly okay to downright broken. They are not consistent with each other in power level in any way, shape, or form. And this we haven't even touched on the magic balancing. I didn't experiment enough with faith-based incantations to have a real opinion on them, but the intelligence-based spellcasting class was absolutely fucking abysmal to play with on my first playthrough. I ended up just being a melee warrior who wielded intellect-scaling weapons to make up for the fact that my spells did fuck all to anything that wasn't open-world fodder. Although, I need to say that FromSoft have made some number of changes to a great many spells since I played the archetype. So there's that. They are tweaking numbers, okay? It just feels like Elden Ring creates its own problems with its design philosophy, then proceeds to fix them with their own specific solutions, and ends up creating a worse product overall. Elden Ring has succeeded as a game commercially, and is largely appealing with its open world. It's also very accessible by allowing players to mostly take any path they want, and will make players of all skill levels feel welcome with things like the summoning mechanic. These aspects of the game, which help create its success, also create the problems of vast empty spaces, problematic linear scaling in what is supposed to be a non-linear world, and janky boss design that takes summoning into account when summoning is not always on the cards for the player. FromSoft recognizes these issues and attempts to fix them by adding sites of grace and stakes of Marika everywhere, along with fast travel to make the excessive dying and need to relocate to another part of the map, which may or may not be leveled to the player correctly, less frustrating. They try to fix the vast empty spaces in this open world, like with Altus Plateau, by just filling it up with copy and pasted content, making each encounter in this game even less fulfilling than the last. And they try to solve the awful boss to summoning balancing dynamic by just making certain summons insanely strong, while giving bosses a tag team of mobs aiding them, or by just giving the bosses fuck you amounts of health. I said earlier that I was going to be pretty petty in this chapter, but truthfully, you can take any of these problems with the game and compare them side by side with any other problems I bring up previously in the video to make them seem equally petty. The point isn't that any one of these problems can ruin a game. The point is that all of these problems, collectively, don't actually ruin what Elden Ring should have been, but are by default essential parts of its ingredients thanks to its underlying philosophy as a game. Elden Ring wants to be accessible. It wants to have an open world. It wants to have players be able to do everything at once. Because of these desires that are at the base of the game's foundations, Elden Ring is unfulfilling. Elden Ring has an empty, lazily designed, lifeless open world. And Elden Ring gives its players so many options to explore all at once that each playthrough will feel like a carbon copy from the last. It will, in some ways, feel copied and pasted, which is a fitting experience for a game like this, I should say. Anyways, let's wrap this thing up. So this is going to be the last chapter of the video. I'm going to cram everything about the rest of the game into this one chapter. I'm sure you're happy about that, and honestly, I can't be bothered to talk about this game in detail anymore because it's just, it actually makes me angry. I'm going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to have an aneurysm. I can't keep talking about every part of this game because I feel like I am just repeating myself at this point. And I'm going to repeat myself in this chapter too, so don't worry about it. Anyway, let's get this over with. Mount Gelmir gives players access to PvE content that resembles the PvP experience. It's awesome. The boss fight with Ricard is visually pleasing, but stupidly balanced. Look here as I take an extra while in my moveset to stunlock Ricard all the way to a second phase. Isn't that silly? And look how long it takes. But did you know that you have to kill Ricard's first phase every time you try to fight him? If you're effectively invulnerable during this first phase because you can stunlock him, then why make the player go through it every time? It takes forever, just let us skip it after the first time we beat it. FromSoftware, what the hell? Just another example of this game unnecessarily taking the player's time away, I guess. Whatever. Mount Gelmir's fine. Although it did have at least 2 more Makar boss fights in it. I shit you not. So actually, fuck Mount Gelmir. Also, it has the Godskin Fatty in it, so fuck Mount Gelmir. The Hlag Tree plays host to Melania, Blade of Michaela. So I don't care if it's amazing or terrible. It plays host to Melania, Blade of Michaela. I mean, look at this. I'm not fighting that. What the fuck? Most boss fights FromSoft puts out is a game of rhythm. Okay? Learning the movesets an opponent and slowly gaining the muscle memory to respond in kind. With Melania, it's less like a game of rhythm and more like a game of Googling the right buttons to press during each and every move she has. And I mean, Jesus, are you seeing this footage? At least Dance Dance Revolution shows you the buttons that you need to mash up front instead of hiding it behind whatever the fuck this is. Yeah, so that's Halagdry. If I ever have so much free time on my hands that I complete it fully, it shall be a dog time indeed. And I'm just gonna say this at the tail end of talking about Michaela. My problem with Elden Ring is never a problem of difficulty. It's really a problem of respecting the player's time. I hope if you've been paying attention to the video, you've picked up on that. I don't think there should be an easy mode. I respect FromSoftware's artistic style. I love that however they make the game, they think this is exactly how it should be played. I don't want anyone altering it in any way. Okay, I respect it. My problem is not that Michaela is difficult. My problem is that Michaela is not a game of rhythm. It's not a fight of rhythm. It's just obnoxious. It's just so like, I mean, why? The mountaintop of the giants is just a shit show of projectile spamming and dragon copy pastes. Remember the dragon from Liurnia? Yeah, that asshole makes a guest appearance, and I didn't even look him in the eyes. I skipped right past that shit and made haste to the giant boss fight, which consisted of more annoying AoE stand there and do nothing while this giant sack of HP soaked all the damage you deal while also cracking your skull with a single strike. Hey, I get it, FromSoft, it's a giant. They're gonna be tanky. But couldn't you have just not made this particular one that tanky? Couldn't you have respected my time a little bit? No, okay. Crumbling Farm Azula is a whirlwind of cool visuals and shitty puns. It also plays host to the worst boss fight in the entire game, the Godskin duo. Look at all that HP. Seeing a trend here? Cool. But not as cool as the mechanic that allows the duo to revive one another if you happen to kill one. But even that isn't as cool as the duo's ability to revive, even if both of them are already dead. I realize that these guys are my enemy, but if they can revive that many times mid-battle, maybe our characters should all become Godskin apostles and just start shaving the skin off of men, huh? This boss fight is actually worth taking a look at, because it perfectly encapsulates what I hate about Elden Ring. This fight, clearly, is trying to be the modern version of Ornstein and Smough, but it is so caught up in the philosophy of Elden Ring that it misses the mark in every way. For those who aren't aware, Ornstein and Smough were a duo boss fight that took place in an arena very, very similar to the one in the Godskin duo fight. The whole point of the Orn-Smough fight was to play a rhythmic cat and mouse with the two, just like with a singular boss, but with the extra difficulty of having to account for two complementing foes. Ornstein was fast, could attack from range, but was weak with only around 1500 HP. Smough was slow, lumbering, and easily readable, but struck like a truck and had an extra 1000 HP or so to play with. The whole idea was to use the arena to play cat and mouse with the two, baiting the speedy Ornstein into your range to make a strike against the Dragon Slayer, while accounting for Smough's large area of zonal control. Or, inversely, you could bait Ornstein to overcommit with a large attack straight into a pillar, leaving him vulnerable, so you could try to wear him down and out of the fight. It's a brilliantly designed fight that could consistently be won through rhythmic practice. The Godskin duo, conversely, is the duo boss fight that matches the Orn-Smough fight in surface level aesthetics only, and fails everywhere else. The Godskin Apostle is skinny, while the Godskin Fatty is fat, and it is there that the differences between the two end. The duo both have extremely fast attacks, disgusting amounts of HP, gap closers that are simply just fucking laughable in how poorly programmed they are, and how little thought was put into how they interact with the map. Remember how Smough could be baited into smashing a pillar, leaving you with a temporary one-on-one with Ornn? Well, in the Godskin Fatty's case, he just continues to do his gap closer into the pillar for ages. He just goes on, and if you so much as misstep from behind the pillar while trying to duel with the skinny, he will zip right past it. And in Elden Ring fashion, instead of making the fight better through proper balancing, better programming, or any other method of design that takes effort, FromSoft decided to place a blatantly overpowered extra summon down in front of the boss room. This is not the summons that you would have on hand already, this is an extra guy. They just put in an extra guy who's super tanky to just take all the heat off because this boss fight is so fucking awful. This guy is designed to be a tank that sits there and RNGs his HP back into full effect while you wail as fast as possible on the duo. I love this fight so much because of how awful it is. And you can just sum up the issues in Elden Ring with the methods of balancing employed here. You've got spambush enemies that aren't thought through at all and don't complement each other in any way, shape, or form. You've got balancing in the image of summoned AI. You've got insane HP bars on non-tank enemies. You've got insane HP bars on tank enemies. You've got enemies interacting with the environment in non-intuitive ways, and they are, of course, copy-pasted to boot. There are zero differences between these godskins and their counterparts throughout the world. What a fucking joke. Also, you can use a sleepy potion on one of them to make them sleep. So basically, this fight sucks, and FromSoft decided to introduce a mechanic to make sure you didn't actually have to fight them as a duo, because the fight sucks, alright? Alright. What else? This area has a dragon that lets you kill it for a healthy amount of runes, along with the Beast Clergyman boss fight area. I actually like the Beast Clergyman as a boss. He represents what I see as what should have been the design philosophy for the rest of the game. He's fast-paced, but his tankiness is toned down compared to the rest of the game. His moveset is a game of rhythm and learned repetition, and his second phase, although substantially more difficult than the first, is still designed within the confines of what can be considered reasonable for a player to be able to adapt to quickly. He's difficult, but well designed. What a concept. And that's the crumbling mind of Azula or something. That leads us to the final staging area of the game, back to the capital. There's a sewer system that hides underneath the capital, but it's probably just shit. This final part of the game really ties the quality together like a high school paper, thrown in with a few final paragraphs that were rushed at 3 a.m. with the help of probably too much Adderall. Like, you know how this video started out as a slow, monotonous crawl through each area of the game, and has turned into a slog of highlights? Imagine that, except instead of a YouTube video, it's a video game with millions of dollars in its budget that's being held as perfect by these assholes, you dig? I can't believe this image exists. It hurts to look at, what the fuck were they thinking? Anyway, the final portion of this game is a series of boss fights all crammed together. You fight the all-knowing Mage of Exposition, the Warrior of Cringe, who is also Margit, kinda.
Cringe.
A statue, and then finally the Elden Beast. Something interesting about these fights is that all of them are actually pretty decent. Actually, save for the Elden Beast, that is. I'd say the fight with the mage felt akin to a strong PvP encounter that showcased some really cool use of in-game spells. The fight with Morgott, which is Margit's true identity, was varied in style and aesthetic. The fight with the statue, at the very least, didn't take up too much time, although going blind every time I entered his boss room was a bit annoying, but fuck it. What I have to say about the Elden Beast is that it's probably the most underwhelming boss in any FromSoft game I've played to date. Yes, I understand it probably makes perfect narrative sense to have this thing be the final boss, but it ultimately just suffers from the same issues the copy and pasted dragon enemies have in this game. It flies away every so often, taking agency from the player as well as time. It also has some moves that are extremely simple to dodge and account for, as well as other moves that are actually next to impossible to avoid at all, leaving the player with no option but to tank it and trade damage as fast as possible. This also provides the basis for the RNG boss fight, wherein the player hopes to get as many favorable moves as possible and prays to see this AoE disaster of a spell as little as possible, where the difference between seeing it often and not at all provides a canyon of difference for how the fight will play out. For me, this final boss was a letdown. Not because it was comparatively easy to everything else, which preceded it, but just because it was boring and uninspired. I can't say the same for its intro, though, which was easily one of the most gorgeous things to look at and listen to in the whole game. And I suppose that's my opinion on this game as a whole. Gorgeous visuals and gorgeous audio, sometimes. All on the surface level, of course. Everything underneath that, the pillars from which this game is constructed, are flawed from the foundation up. Enemies are placed not to enrich the experience, but to mark a checklist across a dull and unfulfilling world that manages to be both empty and oversaturated at the same time. Bosses are designed to mimic the fundamentals of what players like from boss design, but often fail in any tangible sense to provide a lasting experience. And, on top of this, are often copy and pasted throughout the entire game, making their subpar experiences forced over multiple times on the player. The open world is large, sure, but hollow in spirit, and more or less obeys the commands of linearity and progression, as the wild enemy scaling forces the player's hand in which areas to tackle first and which to avoid, effectively nullifying the point of creating this game as wide as FromSoft has. Not only this, but the game does a poor job in guiding the player through each of these areas in a manner that's accurate to boot, meaning players will often find themselves in situations that are only difficult because of a stat difference, and not because of any brilliance on the part of FromSoft. Sort of like a cheap trick that exists to call the game difficult, while also foregoing any sense of that word as soon as the player unlocks enough levels to return to previously left areas and plow through it with overwhelming damage and overpowered tools. This game's a mess. FromSoftware did open world design before, and better, in Dark Souls 1. They already learned their lesson with clunky movement, spam bush enemy placement, and oversaturation in player build choice with Dark Souls 2. And they got some of the cleanest combat and incredible boss design in the series with Dark Souls 3. As far as I was concerned, Elden Ring should have been the culmination of all three of these learning experiences that FromSoft had access to. Instead, it failed on creating a world that enhanced gameplay, failed at learning from the mistakes of Dark Souls 2 in terms of enemy placement and set-piece design, and didn't even come close to matching Dark Souls 3 in terms of combat fluidity and boss fights. It is unbelievable how poorly Elden Ring delivers on all of this. And what's more unbelievable still is how well received this game has been by the community. I have to assume that this is a result of hype and a large swath of people who have never played a Dark Souls title in their life, seeing this game through the lens of novelty. But it's also the case that Dark Souls veterans have made videos declaring Elden Ring to be their favorite. That the game is somehow the best out of the four, and I just cannot for the life of me understand it. To be clear, I can let that opinion be as it is. It is fine. If you like the game, you like the game. And although for some of you it probably seems like I'm being negative for its own sake, I really try to like this game. I have nearly 200 hours in it. 200 hours of trying to twist and turn, trying different builds, trying different mentalities, try anything to see what I wasn't getting about this game. But ultimately, no, I just can't see on an objective basis how this game is designed better than Dark Souls 1 or 3. And I would have to extend some olive branches when listening to someone who tried to argue that because it's open world and because it has better graphics and movement, that it is somehow better as a whole than Dark Souls 2, despite sharing many of the same problems the game has while also taking up far more of the player's time. I could agree with it, mind you, but that's just because I know how poorly made DS2 is. It's nothing for Elden Ring to brag about. Elden Ring is disappointing. Elden Ring is lazily made. And it's blind to the strengths that made the Dark Souls trilogy as legendary as it is. As much as I wanted this game to push the boundaries of what we can expect out of FromSoftware, I'm afraid to say that all it's done is serve to remind me that everyone is prone to failure. And Elden Ring, on every level except for commercial, is a failure on FromSoftware's part. Good luck, have fun.